Welcome to the World on Fire podcast. I am your host, as always, Nick Schweitzer. Now, before we dive into what I consider one of the best kept secrets, not just within the U.S. Naval Department, but for all of the Americans during World War II, I'd like to give a huge congratulations to my friends over at Might and Fury World War II as they are preparing to launch their new game. I've had the great pleasure of not just speaking with the team over there head on, but I've also been informed of how they formulate and come up and how responsive and receptive they are to the community around them that has the need and want to learn more about World War II. I wish them nothing but the best on their upcoming launch. If you have no idea what in the world I am talking about, well, then just head to the show notes and follow the link to their Kickstarter campaign. And on top of that, our youth adaptation of the show will be airing at the end of this month. And I understand 90% of you are probably not interested in an ounce of that. This will be much more of a tamed version of our show, less about the death and more about the understanding and the foundation of these moments. This will hopefully get school-aged children and teens the insights to the war that not only laid a foundation for our lives today, but open a door to their families' legacies. And that's going to be more on that in the next episode. Now that we have all of that out of our way, so remind me, Nick, where again are we? Well, we are back in the Pacific, but probably not in the way that you're going to expect it. This week, we are going to be covering a brief history of the 2-year amphibious warfare revolution that was the United States Marine Corps Raiders. From Makin to Bougainville, the Marine Raiders would infiltrate their enemy deep behind the lines and absolutely create havoc. In the, like I said, 2 short years, these battalions would fight, around 8,000 Marines and sailors would serve on Raider missions, with an astounding 7 Medal of Honor recipients and 136 Navy Crosses awarded. So, let's take a short 24-month journey to the South Pacific under the cover of darkness, silently paddling our rubber rafts to the shore of our enemy. This is the story of the Marine Corps Raiders. Now, for those of you out there that have no idea what the United States Marine Corps is, albeit you're probably an incredibly small minority, even more so if you live here in the States, while all of our nation's defense services have been enacted by Congress, the United States Marine Corps, however, has a slightly different history. You see, the Marine Corps was created by the Second Continental Congress during the Revolutionary War. In order to create an augmented fighting force for the Navy, the Marines would be an infantry-like fighting force aboard these vessels. The first man tabbed to lead was Captain Samuel Nicholas. Now, here is the best part of Captain Nicholas. Instead of some fancy recruiting station, he knew exactly where he would need to find the men that he wanted to do this job. And it was here that he set up the official Continental Marine Recruiting Office at the Tun Tavern in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. That's right, folks. The age-old story that the Marine Corps was born in a bar is for the most part correct. While the Second Continental Congress gave them the blessing, the men were found at Tun Tavern. Now, since that time in 1775, the Marine Corps quickly gathered the reputation of a vicious fighting force and even in having more aggressive fighters. How does that make sense? Well, the Marine Corps are aggressive, but Marines are on a whole nother level. Turning amphibious warfare into their domain, they would revolutionize how forces could attack from the sea. From Montezuma to Tripoli to China and the Boxer Rebellion, and eventually earning their Devil Dog moniker from the Germans in the First World War. This is an incredibly small fighting force, mind you, right? If you've ever heard the Marine, they're few, the proud. Even in today's standards, they are a relatively small fighting force. So by the time Pearl Harbor takes place, the United States Marine Corps has roughly 52,000 Marines in uniform. Now, once the war takes off, it would grow over 500,000 Marines by 1945, still relatively a small fighting force, all things considered, right? The Army ended up with millions within it. The Marines only grew to 500,000. By the 1930s, the United States Marine Corps had begun tinkering with the doctrine of amphibious warfare and how to perfect offensive operations via the sea. Eventually, the newly tabbed Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps, Brigadier General Holland Smith, aka Howlin' Mad Smith, would take the project head on, and at the same time, he began to investigate the potential use of creating an elite small special operations force that would take these principles of this new amphibious assault and exemplify it. Now, this would not be something that would be hastily just slapped together and the men would rush to volunteer to become this new form of elite troop, if you will. Instead, it became a slow and tedious venture into a new form of warfare. While special units have existed in the past with many different nations, the newly fully dedicated special operators only existed within the British Army, and that being of the Commandos. Of course, the Commandos would be the men who would go on to create the foundation for the first official special operating force known as the Special Air Service, or as we all know them as the SAS. So in 1939, after the beginning of the war in Europe, the Marines had pieced together a plan to take old destroyers from the previous World War and provision their use to take small teams close to the shore where they would deploy from small rubber watercraft, land on the beach against their targets. After a year of preparation, the provisional rubber boat companies, as they would be called, who were just specially trained Marines coming from the 7th Marines. They would complete a full exercise in February to show their new skills. They do a full exercise and show off their new skills. Not only did they pass this exercise with flying colors, the Marines and their boats would be reassigned under the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Division in order to solely focus on this new mission. So they're not the Raiders yet. Right? They are not the Marine Raiders. They have just been redesignated and have their own battalion, if you will, but they're still attached to the 5th Marine Division, if that makes sense anyway. While all of this is taking place, it can be assumed that the President, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, doesn't have a single idea that this new commando unit, if you will, is not only being created, but they are training for these forthcoming special missions. Once the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, FDR became interested in the idea of creating a new unit that would be the American counterpart to the British Commandos. Why is this? Well, because, of course, if we have to remember anything, it is that Franklin Roosevelt's closest friend and confidant would be no other than the bulldog from England himself, Sir Winston Churchill. Now, Churchill had been a major proponent of what he liked to deem ungentlemanly warfare. These were men who would slip in, destroy not just the defense of their enemy, but the morale of their enemy. Intense clandestine missions deep within the heart of the enemy to dismantle and disrupt operations. For Roosevelt, he too saw the need for these types of troops. And wouldn't you have it, the United States Marine Corps just so happened to be in the perfect position to give it to him. Now, a lot of people are going to come on here and say, well, Nick, did the Canadians and the Americans not form a special operations unit in 1942? And they sort of did. I will, in fact, give that to you. So the United States Army and the Canadian Army ended up forming the first Special Service Force in June of 1942. And we're getting ready to find out when the Marine Raiders were first put together. The Marines that were now a part of the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines would get a brand new name and designation. They were to become wait for it, the 1st Separate Battalion. That's right, still not Raiders yet. But believe it or not, this simply was not enough for the president. FDR wanted a sustained commando force, not just one small group of men, which this tends to make sense when you think about it. What happens if you send the entire unit out on their very first mission and it's a disaster and they all get killed or captured? Now you're out of them and you start back at square one. For him, the idea of starting over just was not a possibility. And the pressure was no longer about creating the force. It was about creating a larger force that could be sustained. Almost immediately, a 2nd Separate Battalion was enacted and led by no other than famed Marine and veteran of the Bougainville expedition and World War I, and that would be Lieutenant Colonel Evans Carlson. Now, Carlson is quite the Marine. Like I said, he's a veteran of World War I and the American Bougainville expedition. But Carlson had an incredibly unique experience compared to other Marines. Instead of being what you're probably imagining, a rough and tough infantryman or an artilleryman, Carlson was an intelligence officer that had spent a ton of time with irregular fighters in not only Nicaragua, but also in China as well, which all of this experience would prove to be pivotal for working and leading these unconventional combatants through the jungles. What makes all of this more interesting is that in 1941, Carlson is no longer an active duty Marine. He is not even in the Marine Corps at all anymore. He is a civilian advisor speaking against Imperial Japan to businesses basically all across the country. He is going and speaking about how they stop importing their materials and their products, quit exporting to them. He sees the forthcoming war because he has spent so much time in China. He knows that a war with Japan is most likely on the horizon, and as we know, he was right. So Carlson has already served as a Marine and is out. He is back home. But it is during this time that Carlson not only creates quite the friendship with President Roosevelt, but he also becomes a mentor to the president's son, James Roosevelt. James, who had also been a United States Marine from 1936 to 1941, was serving as a special military aide to his father as a lieutenant colonel. Now, he resigned his commission, right? So he resigns his commission in 1941. He then accepts a recommission as a captain in the Marine Corps Reserve. A lot of people are like, this seems insane. And I'll tell you why. He wanted to fight. And being a lieutenant colonel in the White House as a special aide was certainly not going to get him into the fight. So he basically got out and then demoted himself and backdoored himself back into active duty so he would not be a special military aide, if you will. After Pearl Harbor, in the official intro to the war, the Marine Corps Commandant General Thomas Holcomb would officially designate the 1st and the 2nd Separate Battalions as the 1st and the 2nd Marine Raider Battalions, after he got the green light from Franklin Roosevelt in February of 1942. So Franklin Roosevelt signs the official, he pinwhips it, bring the Special Operations Force into service, meaning that the Marine Corps Raiders are, in fact, the first Special Operations Forces that the United States has used. But who pushes it along? Well, enter our good friend Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is currently taking on the insane task of going island by island and beating the Japanese in the Pacific Theater. Nimitz was also very aware of these British Commando units and was very aware of these Marines within his command who were specialized for just what he needed. Once activated, Edson would get his promotion to lieutenant colonel. So I messed that up earlier. He was not a lieutenant colonel. So he ends up, once they get designated as the Raiders, he then is promoted to lieutenant colonel and brought aboard. And he was selected to lead the 2nd Marine Raiders. Well, what about the first? Well, another World War I fighting Marine would be brought into the mix, tasked with commanding the 1st Marine Raiders, and that is none other than Merritt Edson. So I already mentioned him. That was my mistake. Now I realize that should have been Carlson, not Edson. So, my mistake. Edson, however, just like Carlson, was not your average infantryman. Instead, using a different approach, Edson has served as a fierce naval officer in combat operations in Central America. He had originally fought on the front lines in World War I. He ended up becoming a naval aviator afterwards and fought in Central America. Edson was already a Navy Cross recipient when he took command of the Raiders, and his men knew that they had a true combat leader watching out for them. So what I find most interesting is that even though these 2 battalions shared the same mission, their doctrine would be completely different. And this was due to Carlson spending much time with unconventional forces. Edson's Raiders, on the other hand, trained and operated like a highly trained, skilled conventional fighting force. But like we said, Carlson was focused on small unit tactics, right? He's cutting the standard 5 or 7 man firing teams down to only 3 men each. In a way, we can say that Carlson's Raiders became experts in true guerrilla warfare. But the time for training and preparation had come to an end. The Marine Corps had designated the Raiders as a Tier 1 group, if you will. All the new equipment, all the best men would be sent their way to quite literally form a tip of the spear for the forces in the Pacific. Now, let's fast forward just a bit. I've done a lot of talking about the creation of this unit, nothing about fighting yet. So let's go ahead and just get straight into that. So once the Marines had realized that the Japanese were building an air base on Guadalcanal, the 1st Marine Division, along with the 1st Raider Battalion, would get word that they were in fact going to get their first taste of action there. The Raiders' mission would be to take a small island of Tulagi. Now, initially, Merritt Edson had offered to do a reconnaissance patrol of the pending objectives on Guadalcanal. However, it was shot down rather quickly. Planes are already in motion, keep them in motion, so they didn't want to change it. It was deemed that no matter what, the Raiders are going to be best suited for just taking that island. And what makes Tulagi so interesting is that it was defended by units of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force, which is an elite amphibious assault unit. So ironically, the Raiders are going against what could be considered their equal Japanese counterparts. So on August 7th, 1942, the Raiders would embark via Higgins boats under the cover of darkness. This is kind of out of their realm. And we're going to learn in a minute what the other Raider battalion is doing. But the Raiders are used to using remember, they were the rubber craft company, right? Like, they're used to being on small dinghies. Higgins boats are not their bread and butter. That is not what they're training with. It's not what they're used to. So they're already going into this first mission kind of, how do we say, a little out of their comfort zone. So, completely unseen, the Raiders appeared to be in the perfect position for a surprise attack. That is, however, all of their boats would become stuck on coral reefs that surrounded the island. With only 100 yards to go to the beach, the Raiders bailed overboard and swam the rest of the way to shore. Unbelievably, the Japanese defenders had zero idea that the Americans had just landed. From that point forward, the Raiders got to work, only facing small amounts of sniper fire here and there. The Raiders would eventually get to their first objective, and that would be to call in naval firepower. Right? They kind of come in and out. They're perfect. They're in the perfect position. The enemy doesn't know they're there, and they can direct precise coordinates for the ships stationed off Tulagi. Right? So this is great. Knowing from aerial photography Before the mission, Edson knew the defenders were dug in deeply. The very next morning, a Japanese onslaught would begin, with the impressive numbers of the Japanese that rushed Edson's raiders, which would create a cataclysmic fight for the Japanese. Lasting nearly an entire day, Edson had begun to worry his men would be cut down if they attempted to move and went to the beach to call for reinforcements from the Navy sitting off the shore. But as luck would have it, there was nothing. Their communications had been severed, and the raiders, on their very first mission, were alone and outnumbered. It was not until the following morning the supporting 5th Marines would move in through the raiders' front lines to finally break the enemy's defensive pocket. At 0900 on August 9th, Edson relayed that the island was secured. 38 raiders would be killed on their first mission, with 60 wounded. Pretty awful numbers for just 48 hours of fighting. Of the 350 Japanese defenders on the island, only 3 would surrender. But it was not just the first raiders hitting the beach, right? So Carlson's 2nd Raider Battalion during the battle was sitting in the hulls of the USS Nautilus and Argonaut off the coast of Makin Atoll. After the 1st Marines secured Tulagi, the 2nd Raiders were to hit Makin. Now, this was for a multitude of different reasons. They didn't want reinforcements to come, and they were also kind of creating a blunt force attack. So 211 Marines would disembark from the submarines on August 17th. Now, this battle, on the other hand, proved to be an immense boost of morale for the Raiders. It took them less than 7 hours to totally secure the island and kill all of the defenders. It was here during this fight the 1st Marine Raider would be awarded the Medal of Honor. 28-year-old Clyde Thomason would give his life protecting his men on Makin Atoll, immortalizing him in their legacy forever. Now, what makes him so interesting is that Thomason was also a man who had previously served in the Marines and had gotten out in 1939, only to come back and serve in with the Raiders. More so, once the Japanese had attempted to bomb and send reinforcements, the Raiders quickly quelled the fighters and the Japanese withdrew. On the same exact day they had arrived, the Raiders slipped back into the rubber crafts and, under the cover of darkness, returned to the Nautilus and the Argonaut. And this was a huge success. Now, with all successes, there are some bad things that happen, right? Obviously, Clyde Thomason gave his life, and unfortunately, there were men who were left behind during this raid as they were presumed dead. They didn't get to the beach on the time they were supposed to. The Raiders just had to assume that they were killed in action. But they had not, right? Once the Japanese got back to the island, the left behind Raiders would not only be caught, but they would be beheaded. In the first 2 operations, the Marine Corps Raiders, they were a complete success, with all things considering. However, losing 57 men is substantial, and this would only be the beginning of the fight for the Raiders. The following month in September, the Raiders would once again be tasked with Guadalcanal. The 1st Raiders would be given the task of protecting Henderson Airfield, which was serving as the Marine Corps headquarters on Guadalcanal, and they were to protect it at all costs. The commander of the Solomon Island campaigns, which includes Guadalcanal, right? The Solomon campaign, that was Guadalcanal. The commander of that was General Alexander Vandegrift. Now, Vandegrift had hand-selected the Raiders for this mission and gave them additional support from the 1st Marine Corps Parachute Regiment. And that's right, Airborne Marines. It was, in fact, a very real thing, but they were also very short-lived, right? So regardless, the Imperial Japanese 35th Infantry Brigade, led by Major General Kayotake Kawaguchi, it was preparing to take the airfield back. With over 6,000 Japanese troops, they would come via the night and create an almost unsurvivable combat environment. Edson, whose Rangers were dug in deep along the Lunga Ridge, overlooking the frontal assault, gave the order to hold the line at all costs, and that they were not going to leave. Over a 2-day period, the raiders would face an unbelievable amount of attackers, but every time, just as they began to feel overwhelmed, the Japanese would start to pull back. Ultimately, reinforcements for the Marines would arrive on the 15th of September and chase after the now retreating Japanese forces. The Marines would lose just 59 men during this fighting. The Japanese would lose nearly a fifth of their fighting force during the attacks. It would be here during this fight that Major Kenneth Bailey would be severely wounded in the head, but still led his men on their defense of the ridge. Kenneth Bailey would not only survive the fight, but he would direct his men to drop their arms and move into hand-to-hand combat to defeat their enemy, as they were now too close for armed fighting. He did this for 10 hours, right? He had took, I can't remember if it was shrapnel or if he was shot. It was one or two, but in the head was, head trauma. He still directed his men, and he still fought in hand-to-hand combat for 10 hours on this ridge. Now, Bailey would not go on to survive the war, however, as he was killed less than 2 weeks later in Guadalcanal. He, however, would be the second Raider awarded the Medal of Honor, along with the third Raider recipient of the award, Merritt Edson. Now, for those of you wanting to know how important this protection of Henderson Airfield was, this is Edson's Ridge. This is the Battle of Edson's Ridge. So if you've ever heard that terminology before, the Lunga Ridge is Edson's Ridge. So, and that is why Merritt Edson ended up getting the Medal of Honor. What's really interesting about all of this is that the Marine Corps absolutely falls into a love-hate relationship with the Raider battalions, right? The reason why is because the Navy decides to come out and say that these large Marine units are unfit and not optimal for amphibious warfare, and that every Marine regiment should be turned into a Raider, which at the point basically defeats the entire purpose of their existence. So the Navy loves it, but it is this love that is almost like a, hey, why aren't you like your brother love to the remainder of the Marine Corps? And this is where your conventional Marines start to gain a distaste for their fellow Marines serving within the Raider Command. Instead of doing exactly what the Navy thought was a great idea, the Marines decided to create 2 more Raider battalions, obviously being the 3rd and the 4th Raiders. The commander of the 3rd Raiders would be a bronze medalist from the 1920 Antwerp Olympics and a fierce Marine combat leader, Harry the Horse, or professionally known as Lieutenant Colonel Harry Blewett Liversedge. The 4th Marine Raider Battalion, you ask, is a familiar name. The 4th Marine Raiders would be led by none other than Marine Lieutenant Colonel James Roosevelt, the President's son. Now, these 4 Raider battalions would be organized and placed under the command of the newly minted 1st Raider Regiment, which was led by Carlson himself. And here is what is pretty unique about all of this, right? The 1st, the 2nd, and the 4th Raider battalions were all pieced together and trained stateside. It is the 3rd Raider Battalion, however, that is picked from men who have been already serving in the Pacific War, and they are quite literally having on-the-job training, if you will. But nonetheless, the 3rd and the 4th Battalions would gain their experience fighting along the Legacy Raider units in the Solomon Campaign. And this is where another interesting individual would be introduced to be Carlson's second in command for the newly formed 1st Raider Regiment, and that would be a man by the name of Lieutenant Colonel Alan Shapley. Now, unlike some of the other officers that we have mentioned in this episode, he did not serve in the First World War, nor did he ever have a break in service. Originally, he's a Fleet Marine that was a star athlete from the U.S. Naval Academy and had graduated and commissioned in the Marine Corps in 1927. Now, Shapley was a seafaring Marine, but that did not hold back his tenacity and fighting spirit. However, there would be one singular moment of his career that would redirect his path, and it would make him want to just go to the fight. In August of 1941, Shapley was tabbed to be the Marine Corps' detachment leader aboard the USS Arizona, who was docked at Pearl Harbor. And on December 7th, 1941, Shapley would be one of the 335 out of 1,500 men who were on board that fateful day. So Shapley, by this point, is vengeful, and the Raiders are a no better place to find revenge. Anyways, back on target here. We are still not out of the Solomon Islands, and more importantly, Guadalcanal. But since Henderson Field, the Japanese were on the brink of defeat, even with the 7th Marines chasing them down to mop up, or the 5th Marines, my mistake, chasing them down to mop up. The Japanese were able to fall far enough back into Coley Point where they could prepare for a regroup. Now, fearing this, General Vandegrift formulated a plan to get the Japanese before they could fully be prepared and encircled them. On November 4th, 1942, a joint Marine and Army operation would intend to first encircle the Japanese. At the same exact time, 700 Raiders from the 2nd Raider Battalion, led by Carlson, would swing around as far as they could behind the enemy to destroy any Japanese trying to escape. Carlson was quick to utilize the native scouts working with the Australians at the time to help them navigate this intense and long march. Literally, almost immediately, the Marines would come under fire. Now, wait a second, Nick. So they're going on a patrol, swing around their enemy. How long is this patrol? Well, it's so long that it gets the nickname of the Long Patrol. This is 150 miles from start to finish, on foot and under fire the whole way. But it was here where Carlson's years of guerrilla warfare would not only come into play, right? It would be the reason they would get it done. Small man teams sneaking in and out, watching their enemy, and attacking when they were most vulnerable. A real quick story here to kind of explain some of that would be that the Marines had discovered a small house that the Japanese were running their own patrols from. Instead of just jumping on it immediately and killing them, the Marines waited until the 25-man patrol left, in which the Raiders snuck into the house and waited for them to return. That night, when the Japanese patrol returned, the Marines let them come into the house before killing every single one of them. It would take Carlson's Raiders almost an entire month to reach their destination. But what happened? Well, over 500 Japanese soldiers would be killed as the Raiders made their way through the jungle. However, how many did the Raiders lose? They only lost 16. Now, I'm going to bring up a point here. They had a lot more sick and wounded. I threw sick in there. They were this month-long patrol. The Raiders were ravished by diseases from the jungle. So not only are they having to fight the Japanese on this patrol, they're fighting the natural environment as well. It is kicking their ass. But at the end of it, once they finally reach the end of this patrol, they only have lost 16 men dead. Comparative to 500, this is a very big win. So not only is there a massive loss of life differential, if you will, but they severely devastated the Japanese by taking out major defensive routes along the way. One of which, if I remember correctly, there was an artillery unit that was just pestering the hell out of Henderson Field, and the Raiders kind of stumbled upon it and blew it up, right? So as they're trying to get to their objective, they're knocking out other things along the way. So by the end of 1942, the Raiders had truly perfected what they were setting out to do. But now that Guadalcanal was for the most part secure, for the early part of 1943, the Raiders are just moving their way through the Solomon Islands, right? They're just kind of hopping back and forth. They're being used where they're needed. There's not a whole lot going on. So the 4th and the 1st Raiders would be tasked with landing on New Georgia in June of 1943. They would only spend 2 months on the island, but they would face not only awful living conditions, but a fierce hidden enemy. On the 20th of July, the raiders, led by Leverage, would be given the mission of destroying a Japanese garrison near the port of Baroku. As the Marines began the attack, they would be massively overwhelmed by the Japanese defenders and would decimate their forces. For the 4th and the 1st Marine Raiders, this was for the most part the end of their operational status within the regiment and within the war. In November of 1943, the 2nd and the 3rd Raider battalions would be given the task of taking their fight to Bougainville. One of the very first engagements would be on November 9th, when the Raiders would need to break the Japanese defense of an airstrip on the Pivot Trail. Now, on the Pivot Trail, an all-out bloodbath would ensue. The Raiders came up against an unrelenting and well-fortified Japanese fighting position, and 21-year-old Henry Girk from the 3rd Raiders would be fighting in all directions in his foxhole full of other Marines when a single grenade would successfully land in the hole. Knowing they could not survive if the Marines left, he made a split-second decision and dove on the grenade. Once exploded, it killed him instantly, but saved the life of the other men in his hole. Girk would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions. The fighting would continue throughout the night, and the Marines would successfully hold their positions when in the morning 12 American Avenger torpedo bombers attacked the Japanese front, finally breaking their lines and sending the Japanese into a retreat. The 2nd Raiders had been, just as the 1st and the 4th, almost completely wiped out. They would be relieved after the battle and moved into a reserve position. Now, in January of 1944, the 1st Raiders and the 2nd Raiders, under the command of Carlson, would be combined, and by February, the Raiders were dissolved, joining the 4th Marine Regiment, effectively becoming weapons companies where they would spend the remainder of the war. But in all honesty, this is not where the story ends for the Raiders. If there's anything the Marine Corps loves more than anything in the world, it is their heritage. The Marine Raiders were, in fact, the very first signed off on Special Operations / Commando unit for the United States military. And through it all, their life was just 2 very short years. But in 1957, the Marine Corps would once again seek an elite unit, thus creating the Marine Corps Reconnaissance. And they used the foundation that was the Raiders. And during the global war on terror, the United States Marine Corps brought back their legacy. And in 2014, the Marine Corps Special Operations Command would thus deem itself the Marine Corps Raiders. Where still to this very day, the Marine Raiders are wearing the same exact patch the Raiders did in the jungles of World War II. A 2-year experiment led to one of the most deadly modern special operations forces in the world. Thank you all so much for tuning in this week. I know this episode tended to be more of an overview than a deep dive of the individual battles, but for a group of men who deserve more credit than they receive, I think we did okay. The Marine Raider contributions in the Pacific typically are overlooked, but their experience gave birth to the United States Special Operations community. I hope you all go off and do more research on this, because there are some truly fantastic stories out there about these men and their missions. Moving forward, we are going to switch it up a bit. We're going to start a new series, and it could be a 3-parter, but I think this one may turn into 4, maybe 5, depending on how deep we get. We are going to dive in on the last man standing in the East in 1940. We're going to talk about not just the Battle of Britain, but the tenacity of the British during the Great Fear of Nazi invasion. We're going to talk about the unrelenting fight of the British RAF and the Canadian-American volunteers that showed up to learn to fight. We're going to talk about the daily life of the civilians during this horrible time, and of course, we are going to talk about the fact that the British would not take failure as an option. With that, too, what did everyone think of Masters of the Air? I think we're not only in for a great piece of cinema, but we're also in for a fair amount of heartbreak. To me, this is much more different than Band of Brothers and the Pacific, because as I think about the men in these bombers, I realize that they could not run. There's no foxhole, and in reality, there's no help for you if you were hit. as medics didn't fly with them. It's cramped and it's horrifying, and I think this show does a great job of not only just showing it, but kind of making you feel it. I look forward to discussing the entire series at the end of it. As always, once again, thank you. Make sure you leave us a rating and review. Come follow us on all the socials at World on Fire Podcast. And make sure you check us out on Patreon and Discord. I cannot wait for our next series, but in the meantime, you all stay safe, and I'll talk to you in 2 weeks.